England was born an island, but became a kingdom through the sea. The sea has always been both the cradle and the crucible of England's destiny. Around its shores, the waters rise and fall, eternal and restless, shaping the fate of the islanders, who for centuries lived both protected and threatened by the waves. Geography gave England a gift and a burden. To the east, the narrow sea opened toward the Low Countries. To the south lay France and Spain, each in their time imagining the conquest of the island. The channel was a moat, but it was never impenetrable. It was a shield, but also an invitation to invaders. Yet even as it carried danger, the sea carried connection. Ships brought merchants with their goods, pilgrims with their faith, and adventurers with their tales. From amber of the Baltic to wine of Bordeaux, from silk of the east to iron from the north, the sea was not only a line of defense, but also the pathway by which England was drawn into the wider world. The sea was more than geography. It was destiny. Its waters could defend a people in their hour of peril, but they could also open doors to ambition and empire. When storms scattered the fleets of enemies, England was saved. When English sails spread across the horizon, new horizons unfolded for the kingdom itself. In time, the Navy would come to embody not only strength, but identity. To be English was to live with the knowledge that survival and greatness were bound to the mastery of the waters. But such mastery did not arrive as a gift. It was wrestled from necessity, tested by fear, and proven by courage. In the 9th century, Alfred the Great confronted the Viking onslaught. His vision was not merely to fight on land, but to meet the enemy at sea, building ships that could rival and even outmatch those of the raiders. From this seed of determination grew a tradition that endured through the centuries. The Normans crossed the sea to Hastings and bound the island more firmly together. The Plantagenets used fleets to fight across the channel, most famously at Sluys, where ships clashed like floating fortresses. And with the Tudors came the first great transformation, when ships ceased to be temporary levies and became the permanent guardians of the realm. The central truth is clear. England's story is a maritime story. Other kingdoms found their strength in armies and fortresses. England, an island realm, found its strength in sails and keels, in the men who braved storms and battle alike upon the open sea. The English did not invent the ocean, but they came to understand that whoever held command of it held command of the future. This realization would one day lift a small island into the seat of a global empire. The journey from fragile beginnings to maritime supremacy was long and perilous. It was shaped by visionaries and warriors, by innovations in shipbuilding and strategy, by struggles against rival powers who sought to claim the waves for themselves. It was written not only in victories, but in lessons learned from failure. Yet through it all, the Navy grew into more than a force of war. It became the lifeblood of commerce, the protector of trade routes, and the invisible hand of empire. This is the story we now begin to follow. From the age of Anglo-Saxon boatmen to the thunder of Tudor cannon, from the wars with the Dutch and the French to the immortal triumph of Trafalgar, from Nelson's sacrifice to the ironclads of empire, the rise of the English Navy is the rise of England itself. It is a tale of resilience and daring, of adaptation and endurance, of an island people who came to see the sea, not as their boundary, but as their inheritance. The waves that beat upon the cliffs of Dover have long whispered this truth. England's fate has always been tied to the tides. To understand her past, we must sail upon those waters. To grasp the secret of her power, we must look to the ships that bore her hopes and fears into battle and beyond. The Navy was not a luxury. It was the line between safety and ruin, between obscurity and greatness. This is not only history. It is the living memory of a nation, the echo of songs sung by sailors, the pride carried in monuments and traditions, the enduring myth of a people who believed their destiny was written upon the waves. The story of England's Navy is the story of England itself, and as this journey unfolds, you will see how the mastery of the sea became the very foundation of a kingdom and later an empire. Stay with this voyage, for each chapter reveals not only the events of the past, but the meaning behind them. By joining this exploration, you become part of keeping alive the memory of how a people turned an island into a power that once spanned the globe. The sea awaits, and the story begins. Yet if the sea was to become England's inheritance, it first had to be faced as a danger. The very waters that offered trade and promise also carried sails of menace. From the north came the dragon-prowed longships, swift as shadows upon the tide, bringing not merchants but marauders. The island that dreamed of safety behind its channel now discovered that no coast was beyond reach, no river beyond intrusion. Thus, the story that began with geography and destiny now moved into an age of trial, when the sea tested England not with opportunity, but with survival itself. The 9th century was an age of fire and salt, when the long ships of the north came slicing across the gray waters of the North Sea. To the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings seemed like storms at sea, unpredictable, sudden, and devastating. Their ships were marvels of design, long and narrow, shallow in draft, swift enough to ride the waves with the speed of the wind. With dragon-prowed vessels, the raiders descended upon monasteries, towns, and villages, slipping along rivers as easily as along coasts. No warning was too short, no defense too strong, for the Vikings could appear where they were least expected. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, scattered and often at odds with one another, struggled to resist. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, each bore the scars of these attacks. The longships were more than instruments of plunder. They were instruments of terror and of power. They embodied the Viking mastery of the sea, their ability to turn waterways into avenues of conquest. For the English, the realization was grimly simple. As long as their enemies ruled the seas, the coasts of England could never be secure. Amid this storm stood Alfred, King of Wessex, remembered as Alfred the Great. He was not the first ruler to fight the Vikings, but he was among the first to understand that survival demanded more than fortresses on land. It required ships capable of meeting the longships on equal terms or surpassing them. In 897, Alfred set his craftsmen to work, building a new kind of vessel. These ships were larger than the Viking longships, sturdier and designed to carry more men and heavier weapons. They were ungainly by comparison, but they marked a leap of imagination, a conscious attempt to create a naval defense, not merely to chase raiders, but to control the waters themselves. That year, Alfred's fledgling fleet was tested. Viking raiders appeared once more along the southern coasts. Instead of waiting helplessly on shore, Alfred sent his ships out to meet them. What followed was a clash not of armies, but of vessels upon the tide. The chronicles record that the battle was hard fought, with ships grappling together, men leaping across decks, the struggle swaying with the waves. The details may be sparse, but the significance is clear. For the first time in English history, a king had chosen to answer a seaborne threat with a seaborne defense. The channel was no longer merely a barrier, it was a battlefield. Though Alfred's fleet was small and imperfect, it represented a turning point in mentality. The Anglo-Saxons could not afford to remain passive, waiting for raiders to come ashore. They had to contest the sea itself. This idea, that national survival depended upon command of the waters, would echo across centuries. Alfred did not create a navy in the modern sense, but he planted the seed of one. He showed that England's fate would not be secured by land fortifications alone, but by the ships that guarded its shores. In the years that followed, the Vikings remained a formidable threat. They carved out the Danelaw in the east and north, and for generations the English lived with the shadow of Norse power. Yet Alfred's example endured. He had proven that Englishmen too could build ships, sail them, and fight upon the waves. He had introduced a new dimension to kingship, the duty not only to command armies, but to command the sea. The symbolism of those early ships should not be underestimated. In their rough-hewn timbers lay the first glimmer of a national navy. They were not fleets of empire, they were fleets of survival. Yet, survival was enough to set a precedent. It was the beginning of a tradition in which English rulers would look outward, not only inward, to secure their people. The lesson was simple but profound. If the sea could bring destruction, it could also bring salvation, if only one had the will to command it. In this light, the clash of 897 is more than a footnote of medieval warfare. It is the opening act in the long drama of England's naval history. From these modest beginnings, the notion took root that ships could be the shield of the realm. The idea would grow, nurtured by necessity, tested by enemies, and transformed by innovation, until it became the guiding principle of a kingdom and later an empire. Looking back, one sees Alfred not only as the defender of Wessex, but as a prophet of England's maritime destiny. He could not have imagined Trafalgar or the ironclads of the 19th century. But in his decision to build ships and fight upon the water, he set in motion a chain of thought and tradition that would lead there. The longships of the Vikings forced England to awaken to the reality of sea power, and in that awakening lay the first stirrings of greatness. From this point forward, English history could no longer be written without the sea. The raids of the Vikings had shown the peril of weakness. Alfred's defense had shown the promise of strength. Though centuries would pass before England possessed a true navy, the seed was planted in the age of dragon-prowed ships and storm-lashed battles. It was a seed that would grow, watered by necessity, until it became the mighty oak of the Royal Navy. This was the lesson of the 9th century. The fate of the English people was inseparable from the fate of their ships. And as long as the waves beat upon their shores, the question of power at sea would never again be ignored. The lesson of Alfred's age was clear. Without ships, England was exposed. With them, it could endure. His small fleet had not ended the Viking menace, but it had taught the island to think in terms of the sea, to see the waters not merely as peril, but as possibility. That seed would not wither. In the centuries that followed, new powers would rise, and new kings would learn the same truth in different ways. The long ships of the north faded, but other sails soon appeared on the horizon, sails not of raiders, but of conquerors. And so the story passed from Alfred's wooden defenses to the vast armada of the Normans, and from there to the Plantagenet kings who turned the Channel into a battlefield of their own. After the storms of the Viking Age, a new chapter opened with the arrival of the Normans. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the narrow sea, not with scattered longships, but with an organized fleet of hundreds of vessels. His armada was built for purpose, carrying horses, soldiers, supplies, and the tools of conquest. The Norman invasion was not simply a battle at Hastings. It was, above all, a triumph of maritime logistics. For the first time, England was taken by a foreign force that had mastered not only men and arms, but the seas themselves. William's success demonstrated that whoever could assemble, supply, and direct fleets could decide the fate of kingdoms. The ships that bore the Normans across the Channel were crude compared to later galleons, yet they served a decisive role. They were transporters of war. In the medieval world, navies were not yet standing forces. Ships were raised, hired, or requisitioned when needed. Their function was often practical rather than tactical, to move armies, horses, and provisions. Battles on land remained the decisive contests, but without control of the sea, those battles could never be fought. Thus, the conquest of 1066 revealed a simple truth. Sea power might not win wars by itself, but it made wars possible. In the centuries that followed, English kings learned to use the sea as the highway of their ambitions. Richard I, remembered as the Lionheart, assembled fleets to carry his armies to the Crusades. His reign emphasized the necessity of transporting forces swiftly and safely over long distances. His brother John, though less fortunate in reputation, relied upon ships to defend and supply his claims in France. These early medieval kings did not envision a navy as an independent weapon, but they understood its essential role as the lifeline of campaigns. The true awakening came with the Plantagenets. Edward III, one of the most formidable warrior kings of medieval Europe, saw the Channel not merely as a boundary, but as a battlefield. During the opening phase of the 100 Years' War, France sought to cut England from the continent by striking at sea. In response, Edward assembled a fleet of merchant ships, cogs converted into war vessels, manned not only by sailors but by knights and archers. In 1340, these forces met the French at the Battle of Sluys, a clash that would echo through the ages. At Sluys, near the coast of Flanders, two vast armadas converged. The French sought to blockade the Channel and prevent Edward from landing his armies. Edward, determined to secure his passage, led his fleet in person. The battle was fought with the technology of the age. ships chained together in lines, boarding actions launched with grappling hooks, arrows raining from the decks, and the surge of men fighting hand to hand upon the waves. Though it lacked the thunder of later cannon, the scale was immense. Chroniclers tell us that the sea was filled with ships locked together, like floating fortresses colliding in a line of chaos and determination. The outcome was decisive. The English archers, firing from elevated decks, cut down their foes with relentless precision. Edward's leadership and the discipline of his men shattered the French fleet. When the battle ended, French naval power in the Channel was broken. England had won not merely a battle but a passage into a new era, the recognition that control of the sea was as vital as control of the land. The victory at Sluys transformed English confidence. It proved that the realm could not only defend itself from seaborne threats, but project strength across the water. Though the English fleet of the 14th century was still an improvised force, merchant ships armed for war rather than purpose-built vessels, it had achieved something remarkable. It had won a large-scale naval battle against a continental power. The lesson was indelible. England, when it turned its eyes to the sea, could rival even the strongest adversaries. From this moment forward, the idea of England as a maritime nation grew stronger. The Plantagenets continued to wage their wars across France, and the navy, though often neglected in times of peace, became a recurring necessity in times of conflict. The sea was no longer simply the path of invaders, nor merely a road for armies to cross. It was now recognized as a theater of war in its own right. The Channel was both shield and sword, and the men who commanded it wielded influence beyond their shores. Looking back across the centuries, one sees the continuity between Alfred's small fleet and Edward's armadas. Alfred had planted the seed that survival demanded ships. The Normans had shown that conquest required them. The Plantagenets, with Edward at Sluys, revealed that victory could be decided upon the sea itself. Each step marked an evolution in England's relationship with the waters that surrounded it. By the end of the 14th century, the idea had taken root that England was not merely defended by the sea, it was defined by it. Control of the waves was no longer a matter of chance. It was a matter of strategy, leadership, and will. The haphazard fleets of earlier ages pointed toward a future in which navies would no longer be temporary tools, but permanent institutions. The seeds of the Royal Navy's greatness lay hidden in these medieval waters, waiting for the age that would bring them to full bloom. The Norman conquest had begun with ships. The Plantagenet wars had been sustained by them, and at Sluys, the English crown had discovered its destiny, that the sea was not just a passage to war, but the place where England's fate would be decided. By the close of the 14th century, England had discovered that the sea was not merely a passage, but a stage upon which its destiny could be contested. Alfred had shown the necessity, the Normans had proved the possibility, and the Plantagenets had revealed the power of fleets to decide great struggles. Yet the centuries that followed brought not only victories, but turmoil within. The Wars of the Roses left the realm scarred and weary, its nobility fractured, its resources drained. Out of that storm of civil war rose a new dynasty, the Tudors, who would inherit both the lessons of the past and the challenge of the future. If the medieval age had taught England that survival depended upon the sea, the Tudor age would teach it that greatness could be forged upon the waves. And it was Henry VII, cautious but resolute, who first turned that lesson into lasting foundations. When the Wars of the Roses finally ended in 1485, the Kingdom of England lay weary from decades of civil strife. The struggle between Lancaster and York had bled the nobility of its strength and left the realm fractured. From this turmoil emerged Henry Tudor, crowned Henry VII, who secured his throne not only through victory at Bosworth, but through the careful weaving of reconciliation. By marrying Elizabeth of York, he united two rival houses beneath a single crown, presenting himself as the king who had restored peace to a broken land. Yet Henry's vision extended beyond politics on land. He understood that the future wealth and stability of England would not be won only in the fields of the shires, but also upon the waters that encircled the realm. The 15th century had seen the rise of new trading powers, the spread of Renaissance curiosity, and the tentative voyages that would soon knit the Atlantic world together. For Henry, whose reign began at the dawn of this age of discovery. The sea represented not just a threat, as it had for his Anglo-Saxon and Plantagenet predecessors, but an opportunity. Henry recognized that commerce was the surest path to prosperity. England's merchants dealing in wool, cloth, and tin were already seeking markets far beyond the island. To protect these merchants and to encourage their expansion, the crown needed ships. More than that, it needed the infrastructure to build, repair, and supply those ships on a permanent basis. Where earlier kings had relied upon fleets raised in haste, Henry aspired to create a foundation for something lasting. It was under his reign that Portsmouth became the heart of this vision. In 1495, Henry ordered the construction of the first royal dockyard, a permanent facility dedicated to the service of the crown's ships. Unlike temporary musters of vessels borrowed from merchants, this was an institution built for endurance. Docks, storehouses, and workshops transformed Portsmouth from a mere anchorage into the nucleus of England's naval future. With this act, Henry began the long process of turning the idea of a navy into a physical reality. The ships themselves were still modest by later standards, yet they carried symbolic weight. The Regent and the Sovereign, great warships of his reign, were built not only to transport troops, but to project authority. Their very size and presence announced that England, long dependent on improvisation, was now stepping into the company of nations prepared to defend their interests at sea. Though his fleet was small, Henry established the precedent that kingship entailed stewardship of the waters. This alignment of commerce and security was deliberate. Henry's policies encouraged exploration, granting patents to navigators who dreamed of finding new routes across the Atlantic. John Cabot, sailing under the English flag, reached the shores of Newfoundland in 1497, staking a claim that would echo centuries later in the rise of the empire. These ventures were fragile, often underfunded, but they revealed Henry's willingness to link England's destiny to the ocean. Where others saw uncertainty, he saw potential. The significance of Henry's reign lies not in grand victories at sea, but in the quiet foundations he laid. His dockyard at Portsmouth, his encouragement of merchants and explorers, his recognition that peace at home must be matched by protection abroad. These were the stones upon which his successors would build. Without this base, the achievements of the Tudor navy under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I would have been far less certain. It is easy to overlook Henry VII amid the glitter of later monarchs, but his prudence and foresight were indispensable. He was a king of stability, a ruler who turned from the chaos of baronial feuds to the discipline of governance. His ships were few, his resources limited, yet he charted a course that transformed the relationship between the crown and the sea. In choosing to invest in docks, in men, and in trade, he set England on the path from an island kingdom to a seafaring power. The story of England's navy is often told through battles and heroes, but it is just as much the story of preparation and vision. In the quiet waters of Portsmouth, in the hammering of shipwrights and the creak of new timbers, the seeds of future greatness were sown. Henry VII, cautious yet determined, may not have commanded fleets that spanned oceans, but he understood that a kingdom that wished to endure must look beyond its shores. Thus, the Tudor age began not with the roar of cannon, but with the laying of foundations. The peace Henry crafted at home allowed him to turn outward to the sea. And though he would not live to see the triumphs of Armada or the conquests of empire, his hand had already steered England toward that horizon. The legacy of his reign lies not in the battles he fought, but in the docks he built, the ships he launched, and the vision he left for those who followed. The work of Henry VII was quiet, but enduring. He had sown the seeds, building dockyards and laying the first stones of a navy that could outlast his reign. Yet foundations, however firm, are meant to be built upon. When he died in 1509, the crown passed to his son, a young monarch whose energy, ambition, and appetite for grandeur far exceeded his father's caution. Where Henry VII had been measured, Henry VIII was bold. Where the father had prepared, the son would expand. And thus the story of England's navy moved from fragile beginnings to a great transformation, as the waters of the realm were claimed not merely for defense, but as the stage of power itself. Henry VII had laid the foundation, but it was his son, Henry VIII, who transformed that foundation into a fortress of oak and sail. When he ascended the throne in 1509, England's fleet was modest, a collection of a few dozen ships that could be mustered for transport or defense, but could hardly command respect in the great game of European power. By the end of his reign, that fleet had more than doubled, standing at over 50 warships, a permanent naval force that for the first time could be called a true instrument of policy and power. Henry VIII has often been remembered for his politics, his marriages, and his break with Rome. But there is another legacy equally enduring. He was, in the words of later generations, the father of the English Navy. He saw in the sea not merely a boundary, but the stage upon which England could project strength, assert sovereignty, and secure its survival. His father had built a dockyard. Henry built a navy. From the outset, Henry invested heavily. He expanded the dockyard at Portsmouth and established new facilities at Woolwich and Deptford, creating a network of naval bases that could build, repair, and arm his growing fleet. For the first time, England possessed not only ships, but the infrastructure to sustain them. Storehouses held powder and shot, arsenals stocked weapons, and victualling yards ensured the flow of supplies. What had once been a temporary effort became a permanent institution of state. The Navy was no longer an improvisation, it was an establishment. But Henry's vision was not limited to numbers. He sought innovation. His reign witnessed a revolution in ship design, one that altered the very nature of naval warfare. The most famous of these innovations was embodied in a single vessel, the Mary Rose. Launched in 1511, she was among the first English ships built with gun ports cut into her sides, allowing heavy cannon to be mounted along the length of her hull. No longer would ships merely transport men to fight upon each other's decks. Now they could unleash broadsides, hurling iron across the water before an enemy ever came within reach. The Mary Rose became a symbol of Tudor ambition. She was large, powerful, and designed to fight as well as carry. In her, one can see the birth of a new age of naval warfare, where ships themselves became weapons, not just platforms for soldiers. Though her tragic sinking in 1545 during battle off Portsmouth was a blow, her significance endured. She was the herald of a navy that would one day dominate oceans. Henry's fleet grew not only in size and strength, but in permanence. Ships like the Henry Grace Adieu, known as the Great Harry, stood as floating palaces of war, bristling with guns, adorned with Tudor emblems, and manned by disciplined crews. To sail under the banner of such a ship was to declare that England had arrived as a power upon the seas. These were not borrowed merchant vessels, they were royal warships commissioned, maintained, and manned in the king's name. The sea became, under Henry, a symbol of royal authority itself. Just as castles had once stood as monuments of feudal power, now the Navy stood as the projection of Tudor might. The sight of sails rising over the horizon carried not only trade, but the assurance that the crown could defend its realm, strike its enemies, and command respect. To the subjects of England, the fleet was a source of pride. To the rivals of England, it was a warning. Henry's naval ambitions were fueled in part by rivalry. France and Spain were the great powers of his day, fielding mighty fleets to defend their realms and expand their empires. England, smaller in resources, could not hope to outmatch them in sheer scale, but through innovation, discipline, and persistence, Henry believed his navy could secure the channel and protect the realm. The fleet became his shield against invasion and his spear for intervention. The wars of Henry's reign tested this vision. Naval campaigns against France and Scotland showed the growing sophistication of the English fleet. Battles were fought not only by boarding and grappling, but by the thunder of cannon exchanged across the waves. Though victories and defeats alike marked the record, the true triumph lay in the permanence of the institution. Even in years of peace, the Navy endured, maintained by dockyards, sustained by treasury, and guarded as a national necessity. Henry's creation was more than military, it was cultural. The Navy became woven into the identity of the Tudor monarchy. The imagery of ships and sails appeared in art, pageantry, and propaganda. Songs and poems celebrated the power of England's fleet. The sea, long feared as the avenue of foreign raiders, now became the emblem of national strength. To be English in the age of Henry VIII was to know that the crown had embraced the ocean as its inheritance. It is important to remember that Henry's navy, though impressive for its age, was still only the beginning. The fleets that crushed the Armada a generation later, or that ruled the oceans in the 18th and 19th centuries, had not yet been imagined. But their roots lay in his reign. Without Henry's investment, without his dockyards and arsenals, without his vision of permanent warships bristling with cannon, there would have been no Elizabethan sea dogs, no Nelson at Trafalgar, no Pax Britannica. In the creak of timbers and the roar of new-forged guns, Henry VIII transformed England's relationship with the sea. His ships carried not only soldiers but a new idea that naval power was the foundation of national power. In this, his legacy was greater than any single battle or treaty. He gave England the tools to survive, to compete, and, in time, to dominate. By the time of his death in 1547, the English Navy stood as a permanent arm of the state, numbering more than 50 ships, supported by dockyards, storehouses, and a network of supply. It was not yet the Navy that would conquer oceans, but it was the Navy that would make such conquests possible. Henry VIII had built more than ships. He had built an institution, one that would endure for centuries. Thus the sea, once a source of peril, had become the emblem of Tudor authority. Through the Navy, Henry VIII etched his dynasty upon the waves, declaring that England would no longer be a kingdom content with isolation. It would be a kingdom of the sea, prepared to guard its shores, protect its merchants, and proclaim its place in the councils of Europe. His navy was both shield and symbol, both fortress and banner. And though centuries have passed, the echoes of that vision still resound, for it was in his reign that England first claimed the sea as its own. Henry VIII had carved a navy out of timbers and ambition, leaving behind more than ships. He left an institution. His reign ended with sails upon the channel that bore the Tudor rose, a sign that England had begun to see itself as a kingdom of the sea. Yet foundations, no matter how strong, awaited the test of time. After his death, the fleet endured through years of uncertainty, sustained by the dockyards he had built and the vision he had set in motion. And when his daughter Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, she inherited not only the crown of a troubled realm, but the navy her father had forged. In her hands, that navy would become more than a shield. It would become the spear of a golden age. When Henry VIII's daughter Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, she inherited not only a kingdom, but the navy her father had built. Yet she inherited it in troubled times. Europe was divided by religion, Catholic and Protestant, Rome and Reform. Spain, the mightiest power of the age, ruled vast territories across the Atlantic and commanded fleets that carried silver from the New World. England, smaller in resources and weaker in fleets, stood in the shadow of this empire. But under Elizabeth, the English turned to the sea with renewed daring, and in doing so, they forged both legend and destiny. The Queen's reign saw the rise of the sea dogs, men such as Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, and Sir Walter Raleigh. These were privateers and adventurers, men who sailed beyond the known maps, striking at Spain's treasure fleets, plundering ports in the Caribbean, and circumnavigating the globe. To the Spanish, they were pirates. To the English, they were heroes. Their exploits captured the imagination of the people, filling the coffers of the crown and proving that English seamanship could rival that of any nation. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, completed in 1580, was not merely a feat of navigation, but a declaration. England was no longer confined to its island. It was a player upon the oceans of the world. Commerce and conflict were inseparable. Spain's wealth came from its American empire, carried across the Atlantic in great convoys of galleons. To strike at this commerce was to strike at the heart of Spanish power. Elizabeth's cautious support of privateering blurred the lines between piracy and policy, but it gave England an edge. Every captured ship, every seized cargo, weakened Spain and enriched England. The rivalry was not only economic, but ideological. Protestant England and Catholic Spain regarded each other as enemies in a contest for both souls and sovereignty. The tension reached its breaking point in the 1580s. Philip II of Spain, determined to bring England to heel, began preparing a vast armada, a fleet designed to escort an invasion force across the Channel. His plan was simple: crush Elizabeth's navy, land Spanish troops, and restore Catholic rule. For England, the danger was existential. The survival of the realm hung upon the strength of its ships. In 1588, the Spanish Armada set sail, over 130 ships carrying thousands of men, a force unlike any England had faced. Against it, Elizabeth's navy numbered fewer ships, but they were lighter, faster, and armed with superior cannon. The English strategy was clear: avoid grappling where the Spanish could overwhelm with soldiers, and instead unleash broadsides, using range and maneuver to wear down the invaders. The battles that followed were fought in the Channel day after day as English squadrons harried the Armada, striking and retreating, cutting at its edges. At Gravelines came the decisive clash. English ships led by Drake, Hawkins, and Howard of Effingham pressed their attack. Their guns fired relentlessly, and the Spanish formations broke under the pressure. The Armada, battered and scattered, was forced north into the North Sea. Storms finished what cannon had begun, driving the once mighty fleet to ruin upon distant coasts. The victory was more than a military triumph. It was a transformation of identity. England, the smaller power, had defied the greatest empire of the age. Elizabeth's appearance at Tilbury, where she declared she had the heart and stomach of a king, became a symbol of unity and resolve. The Armada's defeat entered legend, celebrated as divine providence, proof that England was chosen for greatness. The Navy had saved the realm, and in doing so, it had given birth to a national myth. From that moment, the sea was not merely a defense, it was destiny. The victory of 1588 was remembered as the beginning of an age when England would rule the waves. Though the phrase "Rule Britannia" would not be coined until the 18th century, its spirit was born here, in the fires of cannon and the gales that swept away the Armada. The idea that England was protected by the sea and empowered by its navy took root in the national imagination. Elizabeth's navy was still modest compared to the vast fleets of later centuries, but its victory proved a truth that would endure. Mastery of the sea was the key to survival and greatness. The Sea Dogs had shown what daring could achieve. The Queen had shown what resolve could command, and the Armada had shown that even the mightiest empire could falter before the winds of fortune and the guns of English ships. Thus, the reign of Elizabeth I became the golden age of England's navy. It was the age when pirates turned into patriots, when adventurers became national heroes, when the sea became not a threat, but a stage for triumph. It was the age when England began to look outward, toward empire, toward trade, toward horizons unimagined. When Elizabeth died in 1603, she left no heir, but she left a legacy. The navy she had relied upon, the victories it had secured, the confidence it had inspired, these endured. In the century to come, they would grow, carrying England from an embattled island to an emerging maritime power. The Armada had been defeated, but more importantly, a nation had discovered its soul upon the sea. The guns of the Armada had fallen silent, but their echoes lingered in the English imagination. Under Elizabeth, the Navy had been tested in fire and storm, and it had answered with victory that became legend. Yet legends cannot by themselves keep ships afloat. Timber rots, crews disperse, treasuries empty, and the discipline of one reign may wither in the next. When Elizabeth died in 1603, she left behind a fleet and a legacy, but she did not leave an heir. The crown passed to the Stuarts, who inherited both the glory of the sea and the burden of its cost, and with them began a new chapter, where the Navy stood not as a symbol of triumph, but as a mirror of the kingdom's struggles between peace and war, crown and parliament. When Elizabeth I passed from the stage in 1603, she left behind a navy that had saved her kingdom and etched its place in the imagination of her people. Yet the fleets that had defeated the Armada were costly to maintain, and the discipline she had imposed began to unravel under her successors. With the accession of James I, the crown faced a new challenge, the burden of finance. The Stuart monarchy inherited a navy, but not the resources to keep it strong. James I, cautious and inclined toward peace, preferred treaties to wars. He signed accords with Spain, ending the long conflict that had defined Elizabeth's reign. For a time, the need for a powerful fleet seemed less urgent. Ships rotted in dockyards, their timbers weakening. Dockyard workers went unpaid, stores were neglected, and the Navy, once the pride of the realm, entered decline. England still possessed the knowledge of shipbuilding, but without steady investment, the fleet dwindled to a shadow of its former self. The early Stuart kings understood the symbolic importance of the Navy, yet they struggled with its cost. Charles I, more ambitious than his father, sought to restore its strength. He recognized that control of the sea remained vital, not only for defense against foreign powers, but for the prestige of his throne. Yet war with Spain and later with France demanded money, and Parliament, wary of royal authority, was reluctant to grant it. In response, Charles turned to a controversial policy: ship money. Traditionally, coastal towns had been required to provide funds or ships in times of maritime danger. Charles extended this levy across the entire kingdom, demanding that even inland counties contribute. He argued that in an age of sudden threats, all of England was protected by the Navy, and therefore all must pay for it. The policy raised funds, but at a steep political cost. To many in Parliament and among the gentry, ship money was seen not as a necessary measure of defense, but as an overreach of royal prerogative. The levy became a symbol of arbitrary rule, fueling resentment against the king. The Navy, once a unifying emblem of national pride, was now entangled in domestic discord. The irony was clear. The very institution that had safeguarded the crown under Elizabeth now became a source of division under her successors. Ships still sailed, but they did so amid controversy, their decks echoing with the larger struggle between monarchy and parliament. The sea remained a theater of danger, yet the greater storm was gathering on land, where disputes over taxation and authority would soon plunge the kingdom into civil war. Thus, under James I and Charles I, the Navy revealed a paradox. It was essential to the security of the realm, yet it could not thrive without resources the crown could not freely command. Its decline mirrored the weakening trust between king and parliament, and its very funding became a battleground of politics. The Stuart kings had inherited Elizabeth's legacy, but they lacked her balance of vision and pragmatism. In the shadow of their reigns, the Navy was no longer the unchallenged shield of the nation, but a contested prize in a kingdom drifting toward conflict. The Navy, once the pride of Elizabeth's realm, had become under the Stuarts a symbol of strain, essential for security, yet a burden the crown could scarcely afford. Ship money, meant to sustain its strength, instead deepened the rift between king and parliament. What had been a unifying emblem of national defense was now a contested prize, its funding a spark in the gathering storm of discontent. And when that storm finally broke in 1642, the question of loyalty at sea proved as decisive as any battle on land. For the fate of England would not be written only in fields and cities, but upon the waters where the kingdom's lifelines ran. When civil war broke out in 1642, the fate of England was decided not only on its battlefields, but upon its waters. The Navy, long a contested symbol between crown and parliament, now faced a choice of allegiance. Its officers and sailors, drawn from coastal towns and mercantile communities, leaned toward parliament, whose cause promised both reform and protection of trade. When the ships of the Royal Navy declared for Parliament, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Control of the seas meant control of the kingdom's arteries. With the fleet in its hands, Parliament could secure the ports, cut off supplies to royalist strongholds, and prevent foreign aid from reaching King Charles. Coastal garrisons starved of reinforcement, while merchant convoys under parliamentary protection ensured steady flow of resources to London. The king's armies might win battles on land, but the sea belonged to his enemies. The Navy's allegiance was not only practical, it was ideological. Parliament's leaders understood the symbolism of the fleet as a national institution, not the possession of one monarch. Ships once seen as extensions of royal prerogative were now reimagined as the guardians of a commonwealth. Their sails, once the banners of kingship, became the emblems of a cause larger than any crown. At the heart of this transformation stood Oliver Cromwell. Though better remembered for his cavalry and for his role as Lord Protector, Cromwell recognized the sea as the true lifeline of power. He envisioned a navy that was not merely defensive, but expansive, one that would carry the influence of the English Republic far beyond its shores. Under his leadership, Parliament invested in shipbuilding with a new sense of purpose. Dockyards bustled again, and new warships were launched to project authority into the Channel, the North Sea, and beyond. Cromwell's naval policy was both strategic and commercial. He sought not only to defeat the Royalists, but to challenge rivals abroad. The Navigation Act of 1651, crafted under his government, declared that English trade should be carried in English ships. It was a bold assertion of maritime independence, aimed squarely at the Dutch, whose merchants dominated European shipping. With this act, Cromwell linked naval power and economic ambition, laying the groundwork for wars that would carry English sails into every sea lane of Europe. The Navy thus became the arm of a revolution. It enforced Parliament's will at home and announced England's ambitions abroad. The Commonwealth, though short-lived, demonstrated what a disciplined and purposeful fleet could achieve when tied to a broader national vision. In its ships, England discovered not only security, but opportunity, the chance to shape the flow of commerce, to expand influence, to redefine itself as a maritime republic. By the end of the Civil Wars, the monarchy had fallen, the king had been executed, and the nation had entered an uncertain experiment with republican government. Yet amid this upheaval, the Navy stood strengthened. Its loyalty to Parliament had been decisive in the conflict, and its expansion under Cromwell prepared England for a new role on the international stage. The lesson of the Civil War was plain. Mastery of the sea was not a luxury but a necessity, and political authority in England would forever after depend upon command of the Navy. From this turbulent decade, a pattern emerged that would endure for centuries. In moments of crisis, the allegiance of the fleet could tip the scales of history. The Civil War had shown that the Navy could decide the fate of kingdoms, its allegiance tipping the scales of power on land as surely as victory in battle. Under Cromwell, it had become not only a shield of Parliament, but a tool of ambition, enforcing new laws of trade and asserting England's independence upon the seas. Yet triumph at home was only the beginning. The Navigation Act, aimed at securing English commerce, struck directly at the Dutch, whose sails crowded every port of Europe. What had begun as a civil struggle over loyalty and authority now expanded into a wider contest for trade and mastery. And so, as the smoke of civil war cleared, English ships prepared to meet not their own countrymen, but the greatest seafaring nation of the age. The Civil War had proven the Navy's political power. The years that followed would prove its global importance. From 1652 to 1674, England fought 3 wars against the Dutch Republic, contests that were not merely clashes of ships, but struggles for mastery of trade, colonies, and the sea lanes of the world. These conflicts, known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, marked a turning point. They would test the discipline of England's fleet, forge new tactics, and elevate the nation toward its destiny as a maritime power. The Dutch Republic was, in the mid-17th century, the preeminent commercial state of Europe. Its merchants dominated global shipping, carrying the goods of nations from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, from Asia to the Americas. Dutch ships filled every harbor, their sails a constant reminder of a people who had made prosperity from the sea. England, rising under the Commonwealth and later the restored monarchy, viewed this dominance with envy and alarm. To challenge the Dutch was to challenge the very structure of European trade. The Navigation Act of 1651 made confrontation almost inevitable. By requiring that goods imported to England be carried only on English ships or on ships from the producing country, Parliament struck at the heart of Dutch commerce. The response came swiftly. In 1652, tensions flared into open war, and fleets that had once shared Protestant sympathy now met as rivals upon the Channel. The First War, fought under the Commonwealth, brought England into direct conflict with the greatest seafaring nation of its day. At the forefront of this struggle stood Admiral Robert Blake. More than any commander before him, Blake understood that the age of improvised sea battles was ending. He crafted a vision of discipline and order, introducing the line of battle, in which ships formed organized ranks to bring their broadsides to bear. No longer would fleets collide in chaos. They would maneuver as units, turning the sea into a field of strategy. Though the war saw victories and setbacks, England emerged strengthened. Blake's tactics laid the foundation for modern naval warfare, and his victories in the Mediterranean extended English influence beyond home waters. The Dutch, though resilient, recognized that they now faced a rival who could challenge them not only in trade but in arms. The Second Anglo-Dutch War, fought after the monarchy was restored under Charles II, was as much about colonies as commerce. The English seized New Amsterdam in 1664, renaming it New York, a symbolic blow to Dutch pride and a foothold in the New World. Battles raged across the North Sea and the Channel, with great contests such as the 4 Days' Battle, demonstrating the ferocity and endurance of both fleets. For England, the war was costly, yet it revealed the growing reach of its navy, capable of sustaining prolonged campaigns against the world's foremost traders. The Third War, from 1672 to 1674, was fought in alliance with France against the Dutch. Though less favorable to England in its immediate results, it underscored a larger truth. England had now entered the permanent company of naval powers. No longer a secondary force, it could contest the greatest fleets of Europe on equal terms. The Anglo-Dutch wars were more than military contests. They were crucibles of transformation. They taught England the value of sustained investment in dockyards, supplies, and training. They gave rise to professional admirals and to the doctrine that naval power was not episodic but continuous. Most of all, they marked the beginning of England's ascent. The Dutch, though formidable, would gradually yield supremacy. England, with its growing population, resources, and ambition, would take their place as the leading maritime nation. By the close of the 17th century, the balance of power upon the sea had shifted. The English navy, once fragile and improvised, had matured into a force of discipline and permanence. Its admirals had learned to fight not as raiders but as strategists. Its dockyards pulsed with industry. Its flag flew not only in the Channel but across distant oceans. The wars with the Dutch had been costly, but they had forged a navy and a nation prepared for global command. From these struggles emerged a lesson that would guide England for generations. Sea power was the foundation of empire. Trade, colonies, and influence all depended upon mastery of the waves. The Anglo-Dutch wars were not the end of conflict, but the beginning of England's maritime destiny. Out of rivalry, out of hardship, out of relentless competition, England rose to stand among the foremost powers of the world, its course forever tied to the sea. The wars with the Dutch had been bitter, but from their smoke and thunder, England emerged hardened, more disciplined, and ready to claim a place among the great maritime powers. The line of battle had been forged, colonies seized, and the navy transformed from a fragile force into a permanent arm of ambition. Yet victory brought not only confidence, but new responsibilities. If sea power was to be the foundation of empire, it could no longer be the possession of kings alone. The fate of nations now rested on fleets, and the question of who commanded them became inseparable from the question of who ruled England itself. Thus, as the 17th century neared its close, a new revolution stirred, a revolution carried once more across the Channel by sails, and one that would bind the navy forever to the destiny of the state. The wars with the Dutch had forged England into a seafaring power, but the late 17th century would bring an even deeper transformation. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution swept across the realm, and with it came a fundamental change in how the Navy was understood, funded, and commanded. No longer would the fleet be seen as the private instrument of a monarch's will. From this moment forward, the Navy would become the permanent arm of the state. A national institution, not the possession of a king. The Glorious Revolution itself was inseparable from the sea. William of Orange crossed the Channel with a fleet larger than the Spanish Armada, carrying soldiers, supplies, and the hopes of those who opposed James II. The invasion was not resisted. James fled, and William and his wife Mary were crowned joint sovereigns. Yet the lesson was unmistakable. The throne of England could be won and defended by command of the sea. The Navy had made possible a bloodless revolution, proving that its loyalty was now a matter not only of survival, but of legitimacy. Under William III, the Navy entered a new phase. Parliament, now empowered by the Revolution settlement, took on a permanent role in funding and supervising the fleet. No longer dependent on sporadic levies or the contested prerogatives of ship money, the Navy received regular appropriations from the state. Its officers were paid from the exchequer, its dockyards maintained as national property, its fleets commissioned in the name of the crown, but sustained by the authority of Parliament. For the first time, England possessed what could truly be called a royal navy, an establishment that belonged to the nation, not to the whim of a sovereign. This shift was more than administrative. It represented a profound change in identity. The Navy ceased to be an extension of personal kingship and became the embodiment of collective power. Monarchs came and went, but the Navy endured. Its admirals answered not only to the crown, but to the laws and budgets passed by the representatives of the people. In this way, the Navy became a bridge between monarchy and parliament, a shared instrument of statecraft that both legitimized rulers and protected the realm. William himself, shaped by Dutch traditions of maritime strength, understood the necessity of sea power. His wars against France demanded not only armies on the continent, but fleets to guard convoys, to blockade ports, and to carry the struggle across oceans. The English Navy, now allied with the Dutch, became the cornerstone of a wider coalition against Louis XIV. Naval battles in the Channel and the Mediterranean affirmed that England could no longer be outmatched. It was not yet the unchallenged master of the seas, but it was already indispensable to the balance of Europe. Institutionally, the late 17th century marked the Navy's maturation. The Navy Board and Admiralty evolved into permanent organs of governance. Career officers rose through systems of merit and patronage. Shipbuilding was standardized, records carefully kept, and fleets organized according to standing orders rather than improvised expedients. The Royal Navy was no longer a collection of ships. It was a system, a machine, a body designed to endure beyond reigns and revolutions. The impact on the national imagination was immense. Where Elizabeth's Armada victory had been seen as providence and Cromwell's fleets as the arms of revolution, the navy of William III became the emblem of stability. It reassured merchants that their cargoes would be protected, inspired confidence in allies that England could be relied upon, and gave substance to the idea that the island was safe from invasion. In an age of shifting dynasties and contested crowns, the navy was the constant, the iron backbone of the realm. By the end of William's reign, England had secured its place not only as a participant, but as a leader in maritime affairs. The Navy had been institutionalized, its funding guaranteed, its role embedded in the state. It was no longer a question of whether England would maintain a fleet, but of how large and how strong it should be. The Royal Navy had been born, not as a symbol of a king's glory, but as the enduring guardian of a nation whose destiny lay upon the sea. From this moment, the course was set. The Navy was not merely an arm of war, but the foundation of empire. Its permanence meant that trade could flourish, colonies could be defended, and influence could expand. The Glorious Revolution had redefined kingship and parliament alike, but just as importantly, it had redefined the Navy. What had begun as the personal fleets of Alfred, William the Conqueror, and Henry VIII had now become a national institution, one that would carry England and later Britain into the age of global power. The Glorious Revolution had anchored the Navy as the arm of the state, a permanent institution that outlived kings and parliaments alike. Under William III, it proved its worth as both shield and sword, preserving England's independence and asserting her place in Europe. But permanence invited new trials. A fleet funded and sustained by the nation could no longer remain a regional guardian alone. It had to carry the burdens of empire. And as the 18th century dawned, those burdens grew heavier. Across the Channel, France rose as England's great rival, vast in armies, ambitious in fleets, and determined to contest not only Europe, but the oceans themselves. The stage was set for a struggle that would stretch across continents, a global rivalry in which the Royal Navy would either falter or fulfill its destiny. The Glorious Revolution had given England a navy rooted in the state, but the 18th century would test that navy on a global scale. No longer was the struggle confined to the Channel or the North Sea. Now, the oceans themselves became the battlefield, and the contest for supremacy was waged not only between ships, but between empires. At the heart of this struggle stood France, England's great rival, whose ambitions on the continent and across the seas clashed with England's growing maritime power. The first great trial came with the War of the Spanish Succession at the dawn of the century, when the death of the Spanish king threatened to unite France and Spain under one crown. England joined a grand coalition to prevent a shift in the balance of Europe. Armies clashed on land under Marlborough, but at sea the Navy played a quieter yet decisive role. Convoys were guarded, French fleets contained, and commerce protected. The Royal Navy proved that it could sustain war not merely in sudden bursts, but in long campaigns, projecting power far from home. Throughout the 18th century, the logic of sea power deepened. England's colonies in North America and the Caribbean, its trading stations in Africa and India, depended upon secure sea lanes. The Navy became not only a weapon of war, but the guardian of empire. Merchants and planters knew that their prosperity rested upon the sails of the Royal Navy, which shielded them from hostile fleets and pirates alike. Every cargo of sugar, tobacco, or spices that reached English ports was a testament to naval vigilance. The rivalry with France culminated in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, often described as the first true world war. It was fought across continents, from the forests of North America to the plains of India, from the Caribbean to the coasts of Africa. At the center of it all was the struggle for the seas. France sought to challenge British commerce and protect its own colonies, while Britain aimed to choke French supply lines and secure its global reach. Two great naval battles define this contest. In 1759, Admiral Boscawen struck the French fleet at Lagos off the coast of Portugal. The French, attempting to slip into the Atlantic and support their colonies, were intercepted and shattered. Later that same year, Admiral Hawke led the Royal Navy to victory at Quiberon Bay. Pursuing the French into dangerous storm-swept waters near the coast of Brittany, Hawke refused to let them escape. His fleet pressed the attack amidst shoals and gales, destroying French hopes of invasion. Quiberon Bay became one of the great triumphs of British naval history, securing command of the Atlantic and ensuring that Britain's enemies could not threaten its shores. These victories were not merely tactical. They secured the lifelines of empire. With France driven from the Atlantic, British forces in North America and India could be supplied and reinforced without hindrance. The fall of Quebec in 1759, the triumphs of Clive in India, and the capture of Caribbean islands were all made possible by the Navy's dominance. The 7 Years' War ended with Britain in possession of vast new territories, its empire enlarged, its commerce flourishing. For the English people, and increasingly for the British, after the union with Scotland, the Navy became the symbol of national greatness. Its victories were celebrated in ballads and sermons, its admirals hailed as heroes, its ships seen as floating guardians of liberty and prosperity. The memory of the Armada had been a national myth. The victories of Lagos and Quiberon Bay made that myth a living reality. Rule of the seas was no longer an aspiration, but an achievement. Yet with power came responsibility. The maintenance of dockyards, the construction of new ships, the training of seamen, all demanded resources and discipline. The Navy was expensive, but it was understood as indispensable. It was the shield of Britain's commerce, the spear of its empire, and the stage upon which its rivalry with France would continue for generations. By the end of the 7 Years' War, Britain had emerged as the foremost naval power in the world. France, though still formidable, had been checked. The Atlantic was now a British ocean, and the empire that spread across its waters was secured by oak and cannon. The 18th century would bring new challenges, but the pattern was set. Wherever Britain's fortunes advanced, it was the Royal Navy that cleared the way. The global duel with France had revealed the true meaning of sea power. It was not only about battles, though battles mattered. It was about endurance, commerce, colonies, and the projection of influence across oceans. In this crucible, the Royal Navy was not merely tested, it was proven. The Empire of Britain was written upon the waters, and its navy was the hand that held the pen. The victories of the 7 Years' War had shown that Britain's destiny would be secured not only by muskets and cannon, but by mastery of the oceans themselves. France had been checked, new territories had been won, and the Atlantic had become a British sea. Yet these triumphs revealed something deeper than military glory. Behind every fortress captured and every fleet defeated lay the true purpose of naval power, the safeguarding of commerce, the movement of goods, and the steady flow of wealth that sustained both empire and people. It was in this realization that Britain discovered the essence of its strength, that the Navy was not merely the sword of war, but the lifeline of trade. From this point onward, sea power would be measured not only in battles won, but in markets open, convoys protected, and fortunes carried upon the tide. By the mid-18th century, Britain's navy was no longer merely a shield of defense or an instrument of war. It had become the lifeblood of an expanding global system, the silent force that guarded trade, secured colonies, and underwrote the rise of empire. Where the sails of the Royal Navy stretched, commerce followed. Where its guns commanded, markets opened. In this way, sea power was transformed into something more profound, the very foundation of Britain's wealth and influence. No institution symbolized this more clearly than the East India Company. Chartered at the dawn of the 17th century, it had grown from a merchant venture into a corporate empire, ruling territories, raising armies, and directing the flow of goods between continents. But its lifelines, the ships that carried silk, spices, cotton, and tea, were vulnerable without protection. The Royal Navy provided that shield. Convoys guarded against pirates and rival fleets, while squadrons stationed in the Indian Ocean and South China Sea gave the company confidence to expand. In return, the profits of empire filled the coffers of London, strengthening the nation's financial sinews. It was a symbiosis. The Navy enabled commerce, and commerce in turn funded the Navy. Every ship built in a dockyard, every cannon forged, every seaman trained was paid for by the revenues of trade. The logic was simple, yet transformative. Sea power equaled empire power. Without control of the seas, colonies were isolated and markets unreachable. With command of the seas, Britain could project itself to every corner of the globe. This union of navy and commerce reshaped London itself. Once a port city among many, it became, by the late 18th century, the beating heart of global finance. The steady arrival of goods from Bengal, Jamaica, or Nova Scotia made its docks the busiest in Europe. Merchants and insurers gathered at Lloyd's Coffee House to underwrite voyages, while the Bank of England expanded to manage the flow of credit that sustained both war and trade. Behind the numbers and ledgers lay the constant assurance of naval protection. Investors trusted that their ships would sail safely because the Royal Navy stood watch. The Navy's presence was not only military but psychological. It projected an aura of certainty that allowed risk to be transformed into opportunity. A cargo of tea could cross half the world because captains believed the red ensign would deter attack. Loans could be issued at reasonable interest because financiers trusted in the Navy's capacity to keep commerce flowing. Thus, naval might was transmuted into financial strength, and financial strength, in turn, allowed Britain to maintain the largest fleet the world had ever seen. Across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, this pattern repeated itself. In the Caribbean, sugar islands thrived under the Navy's guard. In India, British traders and soldiers advanced inland, secure in the knowledge that fleets would supply and reinforce them. In Africa, forts along the coast served the triangular trade, linked by convoys protected from rivals. Everywhere, the Royal Navy served as both sword and shield, a weapon of power and a guarantor of exchange. The synergy between sea power and imperial power became an article of faith. Statesmen, merchants, and admirals alike repeated the maxim, "Command of the sea is command of the world." For Britain, this was not theory, but practice. Its very survival and prosperity hinged on keeping trade routes open. Each victory against France, Spain, or the Dutch was celebrated not only for military glory, but for the security it brought to shipping. Each new dockyard and arsenal was an investment not just in war, but in commerce. The connection also had cultural resonance. Songs, sermons, and political speeches tied the fate of the kingdom to the fleet. Britannia was imagined as a woman ruling the waves. Her power derived from the ships that patrolled them. Londoners spoke of their city as the center of the world, and in many respects it was. Goods from Asia, Africa, and the Americas flowed into its markets, while credit and capital flowed outward to finance ventures across the seas. By the close of the 18th century, Britain had become something new, a naval commercial empire. its navy and its economy inseparably intertwined. The wooden walls of the Royal Navy did more than protect the island from invasion. They bound together a global system of trade and finance. In those timbers and sails lay the foundations of London's rise as the world's financial capital and of Britain's emergence as the first global superpower. This was the great transformation of the age, the realization that naval supremacy was not only about battles won, but about wealth created, commerce secured, and an empire sustained. The Royal Navy was no longer just a fleet. It was the engine of an entire world system, one in which Britain's destiny was written upon the seas. The 18th century had revealed the full power of a naval commercial empire. Britain's wealth flowed across the oceans, guarded by its fleets, and London rose as the beating heart of global trade and finance. Yet empires are never secure for long. The same seas that carried prosperity also carried threats, and the same ships that protected convoys might one day be called to war. As Britain's wooden walls bound together a global system of commerce, storm clouds gathered once more on the horizon of Europe. In 1789, the old order across the Channel began to crumble, and a tide of revolution threatened to sweep away monarchs, traditions, and the balance of power itself. The navy that had safeguarded empire through trade would now be tested in a different crucible, the clash with a France reborn in fire, whose ambitions stretched as fiercely across the seas as across the continent. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, it shook the foundations of Europe. Thrones trembled, armies marched, and an old order that had seemed eternal was suddenly thrown into question. For Britain, the Revolution presented both an ideological challenge and a practical danger. A France unshackled from monarchy and burning, with revolutionary zeal, threatened to spread its influence beyond borders. And with the outbreak of war in 1793, the struggle between Britain and France moved once more to the sea. Britain's leaders recognized that the revolution had created a new kind of opponent. This was not the France of Louis XIV or Louis XV, a rival dynasty in the familiar contests of empire. This was a nation in arms, animated by fervor, willing to overturn the map of Europe in the name of liberty and equality. The Revolution's armies surged across the continent, but its ambitions required the sea as well. France needed to supply its forces, feed its people, and protect its colonies. Here lay Britain's opportunity, for the Royal Navy remained the strongest in Europe, and the Channel was its first line of defense. The strategy was clear: blockade. From the moment war began, British squadrons took up positions along the French coast, intercepting ships, cutting supply lines, and preventing reinforcements from crossing the waters. The Navy became the silent jailer of France, hemming it in, keeping its commerce strangled, its colonies isolated. While French armies marched triumphantly on land, its ports grew quiet under the watch of British sails. These blockades were not dramatic single battles, but the patient, grinding work of naval supremacy. Convoys were seized, merchant ships diverted, and colonial garrisons starved of supplies. French ports like Brest and Toulon lived under the constant shadow of blockade squadrons, their fleets unable to break out without risking disaster. For the people of Britain, these distant operations were invisible, but their effects were profound. By holding the line at sea, the Royal Navy kept invasion at bay and ensured that Britain could continue to fund and support coalitions on the continent. The Navy's role extended beyond defense. By controlling sea lanes, Britain ensured that its own trade continued to flow. Sugar from the Caribbean, cotton from India, and timber from the Baltic reached London, sustaining both economy and war effort. The very financial system that funded Britain's armies and allies rested upon the uninterrupted movement of goods, a movement guaranteed by the fleet. The blockade of France was thus not merely a military operation, but an economic weapon of immense power. At the same time, the Revolutionary Navy struggled. Years of turmoil, purges of officers, and political upheaval had weakened its discipline and leadership. Though brave sailors remained, the fleet lacked cohesion. In contrast, Britain's admirals, men like Hood, Howe, and later Nelson, commanded with experience and vision. They knew that patience was as vital as courage, and that by maintaining constant pressure, they could wear down their adversary without needing to fight every fleet action. The British blockade also had a psychological impact. The sight of British sails off the French coast was a reminder that the Revolution's ideals could not erase geography. France was a continental power, but Britain was an island guarded by its navy. So long as the blockade endured, Britain remained untouchable, free to support European coalitions, free to project its power overseas. Thus, the first phase of the war with revolutionary France revealed once more the enduring truth. Britain's fate was bound to its navy. On land, allies might falter, coalitions might dissolve, but at sea, Britain could hold its own. The blockade strategy was not glorious, but it was effective, and in its steady application lay the seeds of later triumphs. The Navy was not only protecting the island, it was shaping the very course of the conflict, ensuring that Britain's voice would continue to be heard in the storm of revolution. The long grind of blockades had shown Britain's endurance, but endurance alone could not inspire a nation. What it needed was a figure who could give flesh and spirit to the struggle, a commander whose daring would transform strategy into legend. Out of this crucible of endless watchfulness emerged Horatio Nelson, a man scarred by battle, slight in form but vast in will, who would embody not just the might of the Royal Navy, but the very soul of Britain at war. If the blockades had contained the revolution, it would be Nelson's victories that carved Britain's destiny upon the seas. In the great struggle against revolutionary France, no figure came to embody the spirit of Britain's navy more completely than Horatio Nelson. Small in stature, often frail in health, and scarred by wounds that took an eye and the use of an arm, Nelson nevertheless rose to become the symbol of courage, audacity, and unshakable devotion to the sea. His life was the story of a man who fused personal daring with national destiny, and in his victories, the Royal Navy found both its strength and its legend. Nelson's first great moment came at the Battle of the Nile in 1798. Napoleon Bonaparte, then at the height of his revolutionary fame, had launched a bold expedition to Egypt, hoping to threaten Britain's access to India and challenge its empire in the east. To secure his army, he dispatched a powerful fleet to anchor in Aboukir Bay, near Alexandria. If the French fleet held its position, Napoleon's conquest of Egypt could be sustained, and Britain's lifeline to India imperiled. Nelson pursued the French relentlessly across the Mediterranean, often sailing blind, searching without certainty, but always with instinct. When at last he found them, anchored in a tight defensive line, he refused to wait for perfect conditions. At dusk on the 1st of August 1798, he ordered the attack. In one of the most daring maneuvers of naval history, British ships sailed not only against the French line, but between it and the shore, trapping their opponents between two broadsides. Hour by hour, in the darkness and fire of battle, the French fleet was smashed. By dawn, Napoleon's ships lay destroyed or captured, his dreams of an Eastern Empire stranded in the desert. The British victory at the Nile was more than tactical. It was strategic on a global scale. It cut off Napoleon's army in Egypt, restored Britain's control of the Mediterranean, and electrified Europe. Nelson became the hero of the hour, hailed as the man who had saved the East. For the Royal Navy, the battle was a demonstration of initiative, daring, and decisive leadership, qualities that would define its supremacy for the century to come. 3 years later, in 1801, Nelson's audacity was tested again at Copenhagen. Denmark, though a smaller power, had joined the League of Armed Neutrality, aligning with Russia and others to resist Britain's domination of trade routes. A fleet of Danish ships defended their capital, anchored in a formidable line along the coast, their guns ready to deny British passage. For Britain, which depended upon the Baltic for vital naval supplies such as timber, tar, and hemp, this defiance could not be tolerated. Admiral Hyde Parker held overall command of the expedition, but it was Nelson who pressed for bold action. On the 2nd of April, British ships advanced upon the Danish defenses. The fighting was intense, the shore batteries and anchored ships pouring fire upon the attackers. At a critical moment, Parker, cautious of the risks, hoisted the signal to withdraw. Nelson, however, famously raised his telescope to his blind eye, declaring that he could not see the order. He continued the attack, directing his captains with relentless determination. By the day's end, the Danish fleet was crippled, their resistance broken. Nelson's gamble had succeeded, and the League of Armed Neutrality collapsed soon after. The victory secured Britain's access to the Baltic and reaffirmed its dominance of European waters. Nelson's gesture of defiance, his refusal to retreat, entered legend as the symbol of a commander who would not be bound by timidity when the fate of the nation was at stake. The battles of the Nile and Copenhagen revealed the essence of Nelson's genius. He combined audacity with calculation, instinct with preparation, and above all, a belief that decisive action could alter the course of history. He inspired loyalty in his men, who followed him not out of fear, but out of devotion. In him, sailors saw a leader who shared their risks, and a nation saw a hero who carried its hopes upon his shoulders. By the dawn of the 19th century, Nelson was no longer just an admiral. He was a living legend, a man whose very presence lifted spirits and whose victories confirmed Britain's destiny at sea. Yet his greatest test and his immortal triumph still lay ahead. The stage was set for Trafalgar, the battle that would forever bind Nelson's name to the fate of the Royal Navy and the future of Britain's empire. The Nile had shown his daring, Copenhagen his defiance, but both were only preludes. In Nelson's rise, Britain glimpsed not just a commander, but a destiny. Every victory tightened the bond between his name and the nation's fate, and yet all knew that one decisive trial still lay ahead. As the war with Napoleon reached its height, the question was no longer whether Nelson could inspire triumph, but whether he could secure the very survival of Britain in a single conclusive battle. That test would come at Trafalgar. By 1805, the long struggle between Britain and Napoleonic France had reached its climax. Napoleon's armies dominated the continent, and only the sea stood between him and his dream of invading Britain. To secure control of the Channel, he ordered the French and their Spanish allies to unite their fleets, break out of their blockaded ports, and draw the Royal Navy away from home waters. If they succeeded, the road to invasion would open. If they failed, Britain's supremacy at sea would be sealed. At the center of this moment stood Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, already the hero of the Nile and Copenhagen, now entrusted with the fate of the nation. His health was failing, his body marked by years of service, but his spirit remained unyielding. When word came that the French and Spanish fleets had gathered near Cape Trafalgar on the southern coast of Spain, Nelson set sail with determination, knowing that this battle would decide not only the war, but the future of Britain's empire. The Allied fleet, commanded by Admiral Villeneuve, possessed numerical strength. 33 ships of the line against Nelson's 27. Conventional wisdom dictated caution that the weaker side should fight defensively, preserving its strength. But Nelson was no ordinary commander. He believed that decisive action was worth any risk, that the Royal Navy's superior gunnery, discipline, and morale could carry the day. His plan was audacious. Rather than meet the enemy line with his own, he would break it. The strategy, later known as the Nelson Touch, involved sailing his fleet in 2 columns directly at the enemy line, cutting it into pieces. Once divided, the Franco-Spanish ships would be forced into close combat against smaller groups of British vessels, unable to maneuver as a single force. It was an unorthodox tactic, exposing the British to heavy fire as they advanced, but it promised a decisive result. Nelson knew the risks, yet he also knew that only a crushing victory could secure Britain's safety. On the 21st of October, 1805, the 2 fleets sighted one another off Cape Trafalgar. The sea was calm, the wind light, and as the great ships maneuvered into position, the outcome of empires hung in the balance. Nelson, aboard his flagship HMS Victory, raised the signal that would echo through history. England expects that every man will do his duty. The words spread from ship to ship, carried by flags and cheers, binding thousands of sailors to a single purpose. As the British columns bore down upon the Allied line, they endured punishing broadsides, but Nelson's captains pressed forward. At last, victory pierced through the enemy formation, unleashing devastating fire at close range. One after another, British ships followed, and chaos erupted among the Franco-Spanish fleet. The line was shattered, and the battle devolved into furious engagements where British training and discipline proved decisive. By late afternoon, the outcome was clear. 18 enemy ships were captured or destroyed, while not a single British ship was lost. The Allied fleet was annihilated as a coherent force. Yet amid the triumph, tragedy struck. Nelson, exposed on the deck of Victory, was struck down during the battle. He was carried below, where he lingered long enough to hear that victory was assured. His final words, simple yet profound, were of duty fulfilled. He had done his part for England. The news of Trafalgar resounded across the world. Napoleon's hopes of invading Britain vanished. Never again would France seriously threaten Britain by sea. For the next century, the Royal Navy's command of the oceans would go unchallenged, enabling Britain to build and defend a global empire. Trafalgar was not merely a battle. It was a turning point in history, the moment when Britain's destiny as the ruler of the waves was secured. Nelson's death in victory transformed him into a national icon, a martyr for the cause of sea power. His image adorned paintings and monuments, his name etched into the memory of every Briton. Trafalgar Square in London, with its great column, became a reminder that Britain's liberty and empire had been won and safeguarded upon the seas. For the sailors who fought that day, Trafalgar was both an end and a beginning. It ended the threat of invasion and began a century of naval supremacy. It was proof that Britain's safety, prosperity, and influence rested upon the wooden walls of its navy, and that courage and leadership could alter the fate of nations. Thus, the Battle of Trafalgar stood as the defining moment of Britain's naval story. It was the culmination of centuries of struggle. From Alfred's first fleets to the ships of Elizabeth, from Cromwell's navigation acts to the wars with France. At Trafalgar, all these threads converged. In Nelson's triumph and sacrifice, Britain claimed mastery of the seas, a mastery that would endure for 100 years, shaping the world in the age of empire. Trafalgar had ended the age of uncertainty. With Nelson's triumph and sacrifice, the specter of invasion was banished, and Britain's mastery of the seas stood secure. What began as a desperate struggle for survival against France now unfolded into something greater, an empire sustained not by chance victories, but by permanent command of the oceans. From this moment, the story of the Royal Navy was no longer just about battles. It was about a century of supremacy, the Pax Britannica, in which Britain's fleets became the unseen architecture of a world-spanning empire. After Trafalgar, Britain entered a century unlike any it had known before. With Napoleon contained and eventually defeated, the Royal Navy emerged as the unchallenged master of the seas. It was a supremacy not merely of warships and battles, but of permanence, a constant presence that defined the very structure of the 19th century. In this new age, the Navy became the iron framework upon which the empire was built. The phrase soon took hold, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." It was not poetic exaggeration, but geographic fact. From Canada to the Caribbean, from India to Australia, from the Cape of Good Hope to Hong Kong, Britain held dominions that spanned the globe. Such an empire could not exist without a navy. Its colonies were separated by thousands of miles of ocean, and its wealth flowed in the form of goods transported across seas. To keep these lifelines secure was to keep the empire alive. Central to this system was India, the jewel in the crown. The route to the subcontinent, through the Mediterranean, around the Cape of Good Hope, or later via the Suez Canal, was guarded constantly by British squadrons. The Royal Navy's presence deterred rivals, suppressed piracy, and guaranteed that troops and trade alike could pass unmolested. In India's ports in Singapore and Penang, the Union Jack flew not only because of red-coated garrisons, but because of the great ships that hovered offshore, silent yet decisive symbols of power. Beyond India lay the markets of the Far East, tea from China, spices from the East Indies, and later rubber and tin from Malaya. All traveled under the watchful eye of the Navy. At Hong Kong, seeded after the Opium Wars, Britain established a fortified harbor that became a hub of trade and strategy. The Navy's guns protected merchantmen, while its dockyards serviced the squadrons that patrolled the Pacific. In every corner of Asia, British commercial ambition was made possible by maritime command. This global reach demanded a global fleet. By the mid-19th century, British squadrons were stationed on every major ocean. The Mediterranean Fleet, the East Indies Station, the China Squadron, the West Africa Squadron, the North America and West Indies Station. Each was tasked with more than war. They enforced treaties, suppressed the slave trade, policed smuggling, and projected an image of order. A British warship in a distant harbor was a message in itself. The Empire's hand could reach anywhere. The effect upon Britain was profound. The Navy became not only the guardian of security, but the enabler of prosperity. London's merchants traded with confidence. Insurers underwrote voyages knowing that the seas were patrolled, and the city grew into the financial center of the world. Steam engines and the telegraph would accelerate connections, but it was the Navy that gave them meaning, ensuring that goods and messages could move within a web of empire, unbroken by fear. In this way, the 19th century saw a transformation. The Navy, once an arm of defense and conquest, became an arm of maintenance. It did not merely win battles, it sustained a system. The very phrase, Pax Britannica, the British peace, rested upon the presence of fleets. Peace, of course, was relative. There were wars and uprisings, but the larger structure of global order depended upon Britain's ability to move unchallenged across the oceans. The Royal Navy was, in a sense, the sun that never set. Its ships, painted black with white gun ports, cruised the waters of every latitude. Sailors raised anchors in Halifax at dawn, while others lowered them in Bombay at dusk. The empire's rhythm was maritime, its heartbeat, the drum of oars, and the churn of propellers. Without the Navy, there could be no empire. With it, Britain reached its apogee as the greatest global power of the age. The 19th century opened with the Royal Navy at the height of its power, the unchallenged guardian of an empire upon which the sun never set. Yet even as Britain's fleets patrolled the seas with unmatched confidence, a new force was gathering that no admiral could ignore. The force of technology. The same century that crowned the Navy as the keeper of global order would also transform it from within. Steam, iron, and industry promised to reshape not only the ships that carried Britain's flag, but the very nature of sea power itself. The 19th century was not only the age of empire, it was the age of transformation. For centuries, the Royal Navy had relied on the wind in its sails and the strength of oak timbers. Now technology began to reshape the very foundations of sea power. Steam, iron, and steel altered the balance of the oceans, and Britain, determined to keep its supremacy, led the way. The first change came with the harnessing of steam. At first, steam engines were used cautiously, mounted alongside sails as auxiliary power. Many officers distrusted these noisy, coal-hungry machines, fearing dependence on fuel supplies that seemed less reliable than the eternal wind. Yet the advantages were undeniable. A steamship could maneuver in calm waters, sail against the wind, and keep a steady pace regardless of weather. Gradually, sails gave way to funnels, and the Navy began its march into the modern age. The second revolution came in the very bones of the ships. Oak, which had built the wooden walls of Britain for centuries, could no longer withstand the firepower of modern artillery. Iron hulls offered greater strength and endurance. In 1860, Britain unveiled HMS Warrior, the world's first iron-hulled, armor-plated warship. Sleek, powerful, and almost invulnerable to the cannon of its day, Warrior symbolized a new era. When she entered service, no other navy possessed her equal. For a time, she made the Royal Navy unchallengeable, a visible statement that Britain would not only maintain its lead, but redefine the very meaning of naval power. This embrace of technology required more than ships. It demanded infrastructure. Coal had to be stored and supplied, iron had to be forged, and dockyards had to adapt. Thus, the global empire became a global supply network. Gibraltar, Malta, Aden, Simonstown at the Cape, Trincomalee in Ceylon, and finally Singapore, all became key coaling stations and naval bases. They were the stepping stones that allowed the Royal Navy to steam across oceans, projecting its presence from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. The effect was transformative. No longer was the empire dependent on the whim of winds. With steam and iron, the Royal Navy could appear in distant waters with predictable speed and overwhelming force. Diplomats and merchants alike knew that Britain's hand could stretch farther and faster than ever before. The empire's global character was now matched by a navy that was not only global in ambition, but in operation. Technology also altered the psychology of power. The black silhouettes of ironclads belching smoke from their funnels inspired awe and fear wherever they appeared. They were machines of the industrial age, embodiments of Britain's mastery, not only of the seas, but of science and an industry. A century earlier, wooden ships had represented courage and seamanship. Now, warships also represented factories, railways, and the power of industrial society itself. For Britain, this marriage of technology and empire reinforced its claim to leadership. The Royal Navy was not simply keeping pace with innovation, it was setting the pace. Rivals watched closely, anxious to imitate, but the gap remained wide. Each new ship launched at Portsmouth, Chatham, or Glasgow was a declaration that Britain's supremacy would endure. By the late 19th century, the Royal Navy had become not merely a fleet, but a system of global presence, supported by technology, bases, and industry. The empire was stitched together not only by red lines on a map, but by coaling stations and armored hulls. From the Rock of Gibraltar to the harbor of Singapore, the Royal Navy's reach was absolute. In this transformation lay the continuity of Britain's destiny. From sail to steam, from wood to iron, the Navy had always adapted, always found the means to turn change into advantage. It was this adaptability, as much as courage or tradition, that ensured Britain's command of the seas through the turbulent 19th century. And it was this foundation that prepared it for the challenges of a new century, when other powers would rise and contest the empire that the Royal Navy had built. Steam, iron, and steel had given Britain a navy unlike any the world had seen before, fast, resilient, and capable of projecting power to every ocean. Yet the true measure of this transformation was not found only in battleships or coaling stations, but in what they made possible. With fleets that could move at will and endure across oceans, Britain no longer needed to fight constant wars for survival. Instead, its navy became something greater, the quiet guarantor of a global order. Out of innovation emerged not only dominance in war, but also a century of peace, shaped by supremacy at sea. In the second half of the 19th century, Britain's navy no longer fought constant wars for survival. Instead, its power was measured in presence and assurance. The wooden walls of earlier ages had given way to iron and steam, but their purpose was no longer to resist imminent invasion. Rather, they existed to maintain a global order so stable that contemporaries gave it a name: Pax Britannica, the British peace. This peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of overwhelming control. The Royal Navy patrolled the world's sea lanes, ensuring that no rival could disrupt the arteries of commerce. Piracy dwindled, the slave trade was suppressed, and disputes between lesser powers were often shaped by the distant shadow of British warships. To sail under the red ensign was to sail under protection, and for much of the world, the oceans became highways of exchange rather than battlefields of fear. The effect of this maritime stability was extraordinary. Trade expanded at a scale never before seen. Steamships carried cotton, sugar, tea, and coal across oceans with predictable speed, and investors in London could depend on the reliable flow of goods. Insurance companies, banks, and markets thrived in this climate, turning the city of London into the beating heart of global finance. The world's wealth circulated through its streets, secured not by walls of stone, but by fleets of iron. For Britain, the Navy had become both sword and shield of prosperity. It allowed industry to export goods to every continent and import raw materials essential for growth. It ensured that colonies remained linked not only politically, but economically. It gave confidence to businessmen, settlers, and diplomats alike that wherever the empire's flag flew, the empire's ships would follow. In this way, the Royal Navy did not simply defend trade, it created the conditions in which global trade could flourish. The presence of the fleet carried weight far beyond commerce. Diplomacy itself rested on maritime supremacy. When disputes arose in Asia, Africa, or South America, the sudden arrival of a British squadron was often enough to settle the matter without a shot fired. The Navy was not only a military force, but a political language, a reminder that Britain's reach was global and its resolve unwavering. This order, the Pax Britannica, defined the 19th century. It allowed new technologies like the telegraph and the railway to bind continents together under the assurance of secure oceans. It gave rise to an unprecedented integration of markets, from the wheat of Canada to the gold of Australia, all flowing into the same financial circuits. And it fostered the belief, both in Britain and abroad, that the seas were not contested spaces, but shared arteries of civilization kept open by the vigilance of a single power. Of course, such peace was never absolute. Wars still erupted. Crimea, India, Africa. But these did not alter the central fact: Britain's navy was supreme, and its supremacy made global commerce possible. Even rivals acknowledged this. France, Germany, the United States, and Japan all watched Britain's command of the oceans and began to build fleets of their own. But for most of the century, their efforts only underlined the scale of Britain's achievement. By the late 19th century, the Royal Navy had taken on a paradoxical role. It was the world's greatest fighting force, yet its primary purpose was not to fight. It was to deter, to reassure, and to maintain. Its power lay as much in the wars it prevented as in the wars it might have won. Every coal station, every base from Gibraltar to Singapore was not only a fortress, but a promise that the seas would remain open, that commerce would remain secure, that order would prevail. Thus, the Navy was the silent architect of a global system. Britain dominated not only colonies and territories, but trade routes and financial flows. Its supremacy at sea was mirrored in its supremacy in finance, as the pound sterling became the currency of international exchange, and London the clearinghouse of the world. The empire's ships and the empire's banks were two faces of the same power, each reinforcing the other. In this way, the Royal Navy made the 19th century a maritime age of confidence. The sea, once the great frontier of danger, became a stage of stability. And for a century, the world lived under a paradoxical truth. Peace of a kind was maintained not by treaties or institutions, but by the presence of ironclads flying the Union Jack, their very existence shaping the destiny of nations. The 19th century had thus revealed the Navy not only as a weapon of conquest, but as the silent architect of a global order, a force whose very presence turned oceans into highways of commerce and diplomacy. Yet, as the century drew to its close, it became clear that this story was larger than a single era of peace. The tale of the Royal Navy was, and always had been, the tale of England itself, a chronicle stretching from fragile beginnings on a vulnerable island to the grandeur of empire, into a legacy that would outlast even the power it had once commanded. The story of the English Navy is, in truth, the long story of England itself, a chronicle that stretches from the fragility of a small island people to the grandeur of a global empire, and ultimately to the enduring memory of a maritime nation whose fate was forever tied to the sea. To tell the history of the Royal Navy is to tell the history of how a people transformed their vulnerability into strength, their isolation into opportunity, and their island into the heart of a world-spanning system. In the beginning, England was not destined to rule the waves. It was a land exposed and often invaded, a cluster of kingdoms whose shores were raided by Vikings, whose fields were vulnerable to any power that could muster ships strong enough to cross the narrow sea. The Anglo-Saxons built small fleets out of desperation, not ambition. Alfred the Great's modest warships were little more than a shield against disaster, yet they planted the seed of a principle that would never be forgotten. The sea was not only a threat, but also a key to survival. To defend the realm, one must master the waters that surrounded it. The Normans proved this principle with terrible clarity. In 1066, William the Conqueror did not march across a frontier, he sailed. His victory at Hastings was won not just by swords on land, but by the ships that had carried his army across the Channel. England was reminded in the starkest way that its destiny was maritime. Without ships, it was vulnerable. With ships, it could change the course of history. Through the centuries that followed, the Navy grew slowly, sometimes neglected, sometimes revived, but always present as a reflection of the nation's fortunes. Edward III's victory at Sluys showed that fleets could decide wars as surely as armies. Henry V used ships to carry armies to France. Henry VIII built dockyards and arsenals, turning ships into instruments of state. Elizabeth I relied on daring captains and gunners to scatter the armada, proving that a smaller but better-handled fleet could preserve the realm against mightier foes. The 17th century transformed this instinct into policy, with Cromwell and Parliament recognizing that the survival of trade, empire, and liberty all required command of the seas. By the 18th century, the Royal Navy was no longer an occasional tool of kings. It had become a permanent institution, the armature upon which national security and ambition were fastened. As the centuries passed, the Navy carried England far beyond its own coasts. It was the Navy that secured the sugar islands of the Caribbean, that opened the route to India, that protected convoys in the Mediterranean, and that projected power into Africa and Asia. Wars with the Dutch, wars with France, and wars with Spain all proved the same truth. Britain's place in the world was measured not in square miles of farmland, but in the reach of its fleets. The 7 Years' War confirmed this, making Britain master of North America and India. The Napoleonic Wars underlined it, as the Navy's blockades, its victories at the Nile, Copenhagen, and Trafalgar preserved the island from invasion and strangled the ambitions of a conqueror who sought dominion over Europe. When Nelson fell at Trafalgar, he fell in the moment of triumph, and that triumph secured Britain's command of the sea for a century. The 19th century, the age of Pax Britannica, was the age of the Navy's maturity. Its purpose was no longer to fight for survival, but to maintain order on a global scale. The Royal Navy became the world's policeman, suppressing piracy, patrolling against the slave trade, enforcing treaties, and guarding the arteries of commerce. Its squadron steamed across every ocean from Gibraltar to Singapore, from Halifax to Hong Kong. Its coaling stations and dockyards formed a chain of power that girdled the globe. The empire was not simply a patchwork of red territories on a map. It was a web of sea routes kept open by British ships. The true map of the empire was drawn not on land but across the waves. This maritime supremacy had profound economic effects. Trade expanded on a scale never seen before. The confidence of merchants, bankers, and insurers in London rested upon the assurance that the seas were safe. The pound sterling became the currency of the world not simply because of British industry, but because the Navy ensured that goods and payments could flow unimpeded. The City of London became the clearinghouse of global commerce, a role it could never have played without fleets of ironclads guarding the oceans. In this sense, the Navy was not only a military force, but the foundation of a financial empire. The transformation of the Navy itself was equally remarkable. The transition from sail to steam, from wood to iron, from iron to steel, showed an institution that could adapt with the times. The warrior, the dreadnought, the global network of coaling stations, all were signs that Britain would not surrender its maritime primacy to the advance of technology. Each new class of ship was not merely a vessel, but a statement. Britain would lead and others would follow. Rival powers like Germany, the United States, and Japan began to imitate. But for much of the 19th century, Britain remained unrivaled. The cultural legacy of this maritime destiny is immense. The song Rule, Britannia, became a hymn of national pride, sung not only in theaters, but in the hearts of sailors and citizens alike. Nelson's column, rising above Trafalgar Square, became a monument not only to one man, but to a national ideal, that liberty and empire had been secured upon the sea. The National Maritime Museum gathered artifacts, charts, and relics, preserving for posterity the story of how a people became a naval nation. Even in art, literature, and folklore, the sea became part of the English imagination, a constant reminder that the island was defined not by its boundaries, but by its horizons. This legacy shaped identity as well as policy. To be British was to be an islander, and to be an islander was to look outward. Children grew up with tales of Drake and Raleigh, of Nelson and Hood, of frigates chasing enemies across oceans. Sailors were not merely men in uniform, they were symbols of resilience and guardianship. The phrase, "Britannia rules the waves," was more than propaganda. It was the distillation of a national belief that freedom, prosperity, and strength depended on the Navy. And yet, as with all power, the Navy's supremacy was not eternal. The rise of new rivals in the 20th century challenged Britain's command, and 2 world wars would strain even its mighty fleets. But the legacy of the centuries remained. The idea that Britain's fate lay upon the sea had been embedded into the nation's very being. Even as empire receded, even as global power shifted, the memory of naval mastery continued to shape Britain's self-image and its role in the world. What remains today is not merely nostalgia, but inheritance. The traditions of the Royal Navy, the monuments, the museums, and the very language of Britain all carry echoes of the maritime story. The Navy forged not only an empire, but a culture, a set of symbols and values that endure. It taught that vigilance was the price of freedom, that mastery of the sea was the foundation of security, and that adaptability in the face of change was the essence of survival. So the story closes where it began, with the sea itself. The waves still strike against the cliffs of Dover, the tides still shape the rhythm of the island, and the horizon still calls with both threat and promise. Generations have looked outward from these shores, seeing enemies approach and opportunities beckon, and through it all, the Navy has stood as companion and guardian. From Alfred's first fleet of wooden ships to Nelson's victory, from the ironclads of the 19th century to the carriers of today, the Navy has been the unbroken thread of continuity. England's empire was written not only on the land, but carved into the waves of the world. Its routes were its arteries, its ships, its lifeblood, its harbors, its lungs. To command the sea was to command destiny. And so the tale of England's Navy is not only a record of battles and ships, but the epic of a people who rose from vulnerability to supremacy, from isolation to empire, and from the perils of the shore to the mastery of the oceans. This is the final legacy of the Royal Navy, that it bound a nation's identity to the sea, and in doing so, helped shape the modern world. The memory endures, a story sung in anthem, told in stone, and whispered by the waves themselves.